Yo, what's going on, Ghost here? Today I'm bringing us another comparison video between the M4 and XM4, and I wanted to make another one of these type of comparisons like I did with the MP5s because I just been hearing a lot about the model, or I guess the M4. The XM4 is like a no-brainer. That gun's still considered to be one of the best ARs in the game, but the M4, man, I've been hearing a lot about it recently, and I want to make a comparison like this to see which one is the better, I guess, M4. Plus, you guys seem to like the model or the MP5 comparison, the two MP5 ones, so why not make something like this? And also, man, I want to make this because they actually ended up messing up pretty bad. They ended up putting trios and rebirth, and trios and rebirth along with duos aren't very good game modes. I think they're not the greatest. I think quads is definitely the best game mode for rebirth, and or else I would have made a rebirth video. But since we don't have quads, I don't really like trios, and I couldn't really get into a groove with this. So we're going with the comparison today. But I don't mind making this comparison because this comparison should be pretty fun. But before we get into the comparison, I want to say if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. We're on the road to 2,000. And with that being said, though, let's get into it. And here we have the recoil pattern for the M4, and as you guys can see, it's actually pretty tough. This gun kind of kicks a little bit all over, or starts to go a little bit right, and it's definitely noticeable when you're playing it in game. And out of the two M4s, I definitely think that this one is the hardest to control, especially over range, because of the horizontal recoil. With vertical recoil, both these weapons I think are like pretty similar because the M4 isn't like pretty easy to control like vertical recoil, and the XM4 is like I think that's the only recoil that it actually has. But horizontal recoil, the M4, man, it gets tough, and for me at range, man, this weapon is especially tough to control, or at least with the VOK, because when I use a M4 with like an iron sight and just like my normal M4 class setup without a sight, like I be beaming, bro. I remember I love using the M4 without iron sight. Like that used to be my go-to weapon back in the day. And I don't know, man, like now with the VOK, like the VOK gives it more range and whatnot, but like to me it's a little bit harder to control. Now I still would recommend VOK or holographics like with the blue dot. I still think that's probably your best option, especially like now in the current state of Warzone. Like I feel like running iron sight AR is just a little bit tough. It's not impossible, but I think having sights is definitely something that you want to be rocking instead of like iron sights. But it's really up to you. I would still rock an iron sight M4 to this day, but I know for a fact that I would be better off with the VOK. And it's crazy because I think this weapon is like one of the more consistent weapons of just all time of Warzone. I can only really think of like 2 times where this weapon was actually ever like just touched in a patch, and it was like the no stock nerf a long time ago, and then maybe the season 4 reloaded where every gun got nerfed. But other than that, I think this weapon rarely ever gets touched in patch notes or just in patches, and it just remains a consistent weapon. And I swear, man, after every update, whether it's a new season or reloaded update in the middle of a season, I swear this M4 always finds like a few days where everyone's talking that this gun is like meta now. Every time, bro, every time when guns get changed and people don't know what to use, and people are always like, yo, the M4 low-key hits now. I swear, it happens every season, every update. Like, bro, I'm telling you, it never fails. But it's whatever, because the M4 is actually a really good weapon, and statistically it might not be like top 1 or the greatest, but it's still a really solid weapon, a very consistent weapon, and it's definitely a fun weapon to be rocking. And I don't think you'd be let down, especially if you're able to hit all your shots. And when you get into the stats, you'll see what I mean. But yeah, man, the M4 definitely one of those weapons that it's really good. And I think right now, like, maybe aside from like the AM2, it's definitely a weapon to compete. Again, it's not like necessarily the most like powerful weapon, but it has things that makes it a really solid weapon that competes with, I guess, the current meta of Warzone. Because I think like the current meta of Warzone for ARs is like AM2, XM4, and I've been seeing a lot of RPD recently, and I think the M4 could definitely compete, straight up compete with 2 of those. The AM2 is a different story, because I don't really think many weapons compete with that gun, if any, because it's just way too powerful. It's literally broken. But if you put aside the M2, I think the M4 is in a great place to compete. But anyways, with that being said, let's get into the XM4 and statistics. And here we have the recoil pattern for the XM4, and as you guys can see, it shows a very similar recoil pattern to the M4. They both start off by going up and then slightly going to the right over time. But with the M4, it goes right like pretty quickly, and then the XM4 takes a little bit to get to that point where it actually curves right. And when you're using the XM4, you're only experiencing vertical recoil. You're never gonna let it get to the point where it's going horizontally. If you do get to that point, then you need to figure out your recoil control, because that should not be happening. Whereas the M4, at least for me in my experience, the vertical or the horizontal recoil was a lot more noticeable, and that type of recoil is a lot more tricky to control, whereas like vertical recoil is literally just holding your right analog stick down. In this game, vertical recoil is nothing. It's so easy to control, and no matter how much recoil the gun has, like just holding your right analog down, like it's gonna make a huge difference. But horizontal recoil for me, it's a little bit more tricky, because side to side is a little bit harder to control. Cause like I'm not gonna push my controller like, you know, to the right to control horizontal recoil. Like I still need to worry about vertical, so it's a little bit trickier. And that's why with the M4, I wouldn't prefer it over the XM4 over range. I think the XM4 is definitely easier just at range, because over the fact that it's just literally a vertical recoil that I gotta take into account. But yeah, man, I already talked about that, so moving on, let's talk about some stats. So for the M4, or actually we're going to open up with the fire rate. So for the M4, we have an 809 RPM. That's actually a pretty fast RPM for an AR. I think that's probably the fastest that I've seen so far in terms of all the ARs that I've done. And then for the XM4, we have a 721 RPM. This is like the second highest RPM that I've seen out of the AR class. So for the M4 to beat it is actually pretty significant, because at close range, that matters a lot. And yeah, the M4 doesn't have the damage advantage over the XM4 at close range. Actually, that's a little bit of an interesting case, which we'll get into in a second. But the fire rate does matter. And both of these weapons are pretty versatile. Like they can be used at any range, no matter what class that you use. Like as long as it's quick enough, you can use it at any range. And close range, both of these weapons are pretty good at those ranges. So like, you know what I mean? Like that fire rate is definitely something to be, you know, taken into account when you're fighting close range. But something else that you gotta take into account is the damage. So for the M4, for 0 to 29 meters, we have 40 damage to the head, and then 27 to the neck, chest, stomach, and extremities. And then for the XM4, for 0 to 22 meters, we have 45 damage to the head and neck, and then 30 to the chest, stomach, and extremities. Now, you may have noticed the cap off on both of these damage ranges. For the XM4, it capped up at 22 meters, whereas the M4, it capped up at 29 meters. And this is where I mentioned like things will get a little bit interesting, because for the XM4 at 22 meters and above, it loses damage, but it's still more powerful than the M4 at 0 to 29 meters, which is crazy. But I'll get into that in a little bit, because let me just talk about the damage stats for a sec. So for 29 meters and above for the M4, we have 34 damage to the head and then 23 to the rest of the body. That's a very significant damage drop off in comparison to what it just had. Pretty weak statistically. And then for 22 meters and above for the XM4, we have 40 damage to the head and neck, and then 27 to the chest, stomach, and extremities. Now these are pretty much the same damage values as the M4, except for the neck damage. The neck damage is significantly stronger for the XM4 in this situation. But to be honest, damage doesn't tell the whole story, because yes, the XM4 does outgun the M4 in terms of damage statistically, but in my opinion, just fire rate is way more like valuable in this situation, because fire rate, man, just allows this M4 to be able to compete with this weapon. And not me personally, I still would probably pick the XM4 over the M4, but just because damage wise it's not stronger than the XM4, like doesn't mean that the M4 can't compete. And I'm not picking the XM4 over the M4 because of the damage. There's a lot of other reasons why, and if I got a little bit of time, I'll tell you why. But the reason I say that the M4 could compete with the XM4 despite it being significantly overpowered, or underpowered, I guess. Yeah, I guess the M4 is significantly underpowered than the XM4. It's just because of fire rate. And I say this because fire rate in certain situations, like, it just allows for weapons to just, no matter what, be able to compete. If you take a look at the Mac 10, that weapon statistically isn't the greatest in terms of damage, but the stupid fast fire rate that it has of the 1,118 RPM, like, allows for it to always be in the conversation as like the best SMG. It's the consistent SMG of Warzone. It's always in conversation. It's always able to compete, and no other SMG that's always in meta ever has compared to the fire rate of the Mac 10. And they always been like, most of the like meta SMGs are much more powerful than the Mac 10, but fire rate wise, they don't even come close. The only other weapons that I can think of that come close to fire rate are the Fennec and the CX9. And those weapons aren't like necessarily meta. Like, they're pretty good, but they're not meta. The Mac 10, like, it's, you know, very, very consistent in meta. And the same goes with the M4. Like, not many other ARs come close to the fire rate of, I wouldn't say come close, but they're not faster than the M4. The only gun that I can think of that's slightly faster is the Ram, but the XM4, you know, slightly slower, and then the C58 and EM2, those two are like very slower in comparison to the M4. And at close to medium range, bro, even though the C58 and AM2 are way more powerful than the M4, they're gonna get gunned just because of the fire rate. And that also includes the XM4. I think the M4 could definitely outgun the XM4 at range, or not range, or close range and medium range. It just really depends on like certain factors, but. You know, anyways, regardless, man, don't let the statistics like scare you away from the M4. The M4 is still a very like reliable weapon. I still probably gonna be using it here and there. In between this comparison though, I definitely am gonna pick the XM4 over the M4. Again, it's not really because of the damage. It's more so about the vertical recoil and, believe it or not, the reticles. The reticles on the 3x scope for Cold War weapons are way better than like the T-pose or even Blue Dot. I just love them. I really do. And you know, the XM4, man, it has those. So, anyways, man, with that being said, let me know which M4 you prefer and why. And yeah, man, thank you guys for watching. See you guys later, and I'm out. Peace.